The round connects at 22,000 feet over the North Sea. There is no tracer warning, no dramatic streak cutting across the sky. Just a sudden shatter of glass and aluminum as the canopy of a Focke-Wulf 190 explodes outward. The fighter jerks violently to the right, begins to roll, and drops through a bank of gray cloud trailing a ribbon of smoke. Inside the B-17, no one shouts. The waist gunner who fired the burst does not celebrate. He releases the trigger, lets the Browning cool, reloads, and scans the sky for the next silhouette. Because at this altitude, triumph lasts less than a second. The wreckage punches through the cloud layer and vanishes toward the freezing sea. 6 other crewmen saw it. The range had been absurd. The angle worse. Under the manual's logic, the hit should not have been possible. But it happened. And in January 1943, over Europe, impossible shots mattered. The air war had become arithmetic. Every bomber that crossed the English Channel carried 10 men and roughly 6 tons of bombs. Every bomber that failed to return erased years of training, millions of dollars in machinery, and futures that would be reduced to folded telegrams delivered in quiet kitchens before spring. The numbers were merciless. Out of every 100 bombers that penetrated German airspace, 12 did not come home. On certain missions, it was 20. The 8th Air Force called it acceptable attrition. The crews called it something else. The German fighters were efficient, disciplined, and increasingly bold. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s climbed above the bomber stream, rolled inverted, and dove straight through formation at closing speeds that turned 8 seconds into eternity. Cannon fire flashed from their noses. Wings tore open. Engines ignited. Fuel tanks burst. Then the fighters rolled away before the defensive guns could find them. Most gunners fired late. Most fired behind the target. Most fired because not firing felt worse. The doctrine was clear. Bomber gunners existed to discourage, not destroy. Their role was suppressive. Fill the air with enough steel to force the attacker to break off early. Survival, not victory. That was the theory. But theory did not account for -40-degree wind slicing through an unpressurized fuselage. It did not account for oxygen masks frosting from breath or hydraulic fluid thickening in the lines. It did not account for the fact that a fighter crossing laterally at 300 miles per hour required a lead distance the human brain resisted calculating under fire. The K-13 ring-in post sight mounted to each 50 caliber Browning was simple, elegant, even. Frame the target in the ring. Center it. Fire. It worked beautifully. If the enemy flew straight at you. They never did. By the winter of 1943, the war in the air had become a contest of margins. German pilots adapted quickly. They attacked from 12 o'clock high, where only a handful of guns could engage. They dove at angles that maximized deflection and minimized exposure. They exploited blind spots with methodical precision. The Americans responded with tighter formations, overlapping fields of fire, mutual support geometry. It helped. Not enough. Post-mission reports showed staggering inefficiency. Thousands of rounds expended per confirmed kill. Some analyses estimated 5,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition for every German fighter destroyed. 5,000 rounds weighed more than 1,500 pounds. That was weight that could have been fuel, or armor, or bombs. Inefficiency compounded. And inside one B-17 flying out of England, a staff sergeant from Dayton, Ohio, began to suspect the problem was not courage. It was geometry. Before the war, he had calibrated lathes. Not operated them. Calibrated them. When a machinist set a cutting tool to 5,000ths of an inch, it had to cut 5, not 4, not 6. Exactly 5. Precision was not philosophical. Precision was outcome. His father repaired clocks. Escapements, springs, gears measured in fractions of a millimeter. If a spring was bent by a degree, the clock gained minutes each week. He grew up believing systems either compensated for reality or they failed. There was no middle ground. When he joined the Army Air Forces in 1942, he assumed war would value that mindset. He was partly right. But improvements did not always flow from the top down. Sometimes they began in the cold, at altitude, with a gunner staring at a sight that did not match the physics of combat. His first mission over occupied France ended in frustration. He fired 60 rounds at a diving fighter and hit nothing. The tracers curved uselessly behind the enemy's tail. Back at base, he checked the gun. No malfunction. Check the ammunition. No defect. The failure was not mechanical. It was mathematical. At 600 yards, a fighter traveling 300 miles per hour moves roughly 440 feet per second. The 50 caliber bullet leaves the barrel at nearly 2,900 feet per second. Time of flight at that range is roughly 7/10 of a second. In 7/10 of a second, the fighter moves another 300 feet. You do not shoot at the airplane. You shoot at empty sky ahead of it. The K-13 sight did not account for that. It assumed a stationary problem. Air combat was not stationary. After that mission, while others debriefed, he remained with the aircraft. He removed the side panel from the gun mount and studied the sight housing. The center post. The outer ring. Fixed. Static. It embodied an assumption that no longer existed. He began sketching on scrap paper. Average engagement ranges. Estimated crossing speeds. Dive angles. He calculated approximate lead distances for typical attacks from 12 o'clock high and from crossing angles at 10 and 2. He wasn't the first gunner to notice the deficiency. He might have been the first to refuse to accept it. By February 1943, the 8th Air Force had lost more than 600 aircraft. The official solution was formation density. More guns. More overlapping arcs. It was sound in theory. But theory did not change the fact that individual gunners were aiming at where fighters had been, not where they were going. The sergeant stared at the sight again that night under a maintenance lamp, and he decided that if the sight could not calculate lead for him, he would force it to. He did not announce what he was about to do. There was no formal proposal, no request routed through command channels. The Army Air Forces had procedures for everything, and none of those procedures included bending issued equipment with pliers on a freezing hardstand in the dark. But procedures were written for orderly systems. Combat was not orderly. That night, long after the rest of the crew had gone to debrief, he pulled the K-13 sight from its mount and laid it on the wing of the B-17. A single maintenance lamp cast a cone of light over aluminum skin still warm from flight. He measured the ring. He measured the center post. He thought about average engagement ranges, 600 to 800 yards. He thought about crossing speeds, 300 miles per hour, sometimes more. He thought about bullet flight time and closure angles, and the way a fighter diving from 12 o'clock high did not simply cross left to right, but dropped and advanced simultaneously. Then he did something simple. He bent the center post forward. Not dramatically, not visibly crooked, just enough. A few millimeters at the base translated into hundreds of feet of lead at range. It was crude. It was imprecise. It was unauthorized. But it forced his eye to aim ahead of instinct. He reassembled the housing, test-fired the gun on the ground, confirmed the mechanism still functioned smoothly. There was no visible sign of tampering unless someone leaned close and knew what to look for. He told no one. If it failed, he alone would answer for it. If it worked, the formation would never know why. 3 days later, they flew against Wilhelmshaven. The U-boat pins were hardened concrete, massive blocks of reinforced structure that demanded direct hits. The Germans defended them accordingly. Flak batteries ringed the coastline. Fighter squadrons staged inland. Clear skies stretched across the North Sea. Clear skies were bad. They crossed the Dutch coast at 23,000 feet in tight formation. 60 bombers in staggered boxes, contrails drawing white scars across blue. The first attack came early. 6 Focke-Wulf 190s climbing from below, curving toward the nose of the formation. The lead aircraft opened fire, and within seconds the entire box thundered with 50 caliber bursts. Inside the fuselage, the sound was concussive. Machine guns firing inside an aluminum cylinder amplified every vibration. Thought collapsed into reflex. He tracked a 190 rolling out of its dive into a climbing right turn. Under normal conditions, he would have framed the aircraft in the ring and fired when it felt centered. Now the sight picture was different. The forward-biased post forced his aim ahead. He added a fraction more lead, more than training would have allowed, and pressed the trigger. 18 rounds. The tracers did not chase the fighter. They waited for it. The 190 flew into the stream. Strikes stitched along its wing route. Panels tore free. The turn flattened. Smoke trailed from the fuselage. The German pilot broke off, diving out of formation. He did not claim the kill. He did not announce success. He reloaded and searched for the next threat. But the ball turret gunner had seen the impacts. So had the tail. After landing, Someone asked how he had judged the lead. He shrugged. Guessing. It was not guessing. It was calibration. The next mission confirmed it. A Messerschmitt 109 climbing after a diving pass. He fired earlier than instinct allowed. The round struck the engine cowling. The 109 rolled inverted and fell away trailing debris. Now the crew was watching. The pilot asked if he had changed ammunition. The crew chief inspected the gun mount. The sergeant answered calmly. Nothing had changed. Nothing visible, at least. Word began to circulate quietly through the squadron. Other gunners approached him on the hard stand and asked how he was judging deflection. He gave them the math. At 600 yards, aim 300 feet ahead. At 800, farther. Ignore where the aircraft is. Shoot where it will be. Some improved immediately. Most struggled. Training is hard to unlearn under fire. Instinct pulls the eye back toward the target's nose. He didn't blame them. Instead, he refined his own offset after every mission. He kept a notebook, range estimates, angle approximations, hit observations. He adjusted the bend slightly after each engagement, a machinist calibrating a tool under live conditions. Measure, adjust, test, repeat. By April 1943, bomber losses remained heavy. The Air Force continued emphasizing formation discipline and overlapping fields of fire. It was logical doctrine. It was also incomplete. The sergeant understood something simple. Suppression was not enough. Accuracy changed behavior. If fighters believed they could close safely, they would press attacks. If they began taking hits earlier, before reaching firing range, their risk calculation shifted. The margin narrowed. On April 17th, that margin would collapse entirely. Target, Bremen, industrial center deep inside Germany. The route crossed the Frisian Islands and pushed into dense air defense territory. Cloud cover hung at 15,000 feet, forcing the formation higher, 24,000 feet, thinner air, reduced engine margin. 40 miles from the target, they were intercepted. Not a probing attack, a coordinated assault. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs from multiple vectors. The lead box absorbed the first wave. The high squadron engaged the second. His aircraft flew in the low element, slightly aft and left. A Focke-Wulf 190 broke through the lead formation and angled down from 11 o'clock high. Distance, approximately 800 yards. Dive angle, steep. Speed, likely approaching 400 miles per hour. He tracked. He calculated without consciously calculating. Bullet time of flight, just under 1 second. Target movement in that second, nearly 600 feet. But the dive angle altered everything. The fighter was not merely crossing. It was descending and closing simultaneously. There was no time for arithmetic, only calibration. He led the shot far ahead, 5 aircraft lengths beyond instinct, and pressed the trigger. The first rounds passed ahead of the fighter. He adjusted without thinking, walking the stream slightly right, slightly down, toward where the Focke-Wulf's dive would intersect the air. Then the geometry locked. The 190 flew directly into the convergence point. The impacts were visible even at range. Flashes along the engine cowling, splinters from the propeller hub, a spiderweb crack across the canopy. Then the nose dipped. Not into a controlled spiral. Not into a trailing descent. It came apart. The engine tore free first. One wing sheared at the root. The fuselage folded mid-span as if struck by an invisible hammer. Debris scattered through the formation, tumbling past the bomber in metallic fragments. He released the trigger. The Browning vibrated against its mount. Smoke curled from the barrel. His ears rang with the concussive echo inside the fuselage. Over the intercom, the ball turret gunner's voice broke through. He's breaking up. Confirmed. The pilot asked for range. 800 yards. Maybe more. There was no doubt. The wreckage had passed within 200 feet of their wing. 800 yards. The manual did not recommend deflection shooting at that distance. The K-13 site was not designed for it. Training did not prepare for it. But it had happened. They dropped their bombs, turned west, and flew home in silence. After landing, he was not sent back to quarters. He was escorted to the briefing room. The squadron gunnery officer was waiting. So was the group intelligence officer. His pilot stood to one side, arms folded, expression unreadable. They asked for everything. Range estimate, angle of attack, time of burst, lead distance. He described the dive angle, the closure rate, the way the fighter's path intersected the convergence point. They listened carefully. Then they asked to inspect his gun. The Browning was standard issue. Then they asked to inspect the site. The crew chief was present now. He had noticed the slight forward lean of the center post weeks earlier and said nothing. The gunnery officer leaned in close. He saw it. The bend. Subtle. Deliberate. He looked up. Did you modify this? There are moments in war when a man weighs consequences in seconds. He could deny it. Call it luck. Blame instinct. But 60 bombers had come home that day, and perhaps the difference between 60 and 59 was sitting on that mount. Yes, he said. He explained the math. Average engagement range. Bullet time of flight. Typical crossing speeds. He described the offset, a calculated forward bias to force deflection compensation. Unauthorized. Unapproved. But effective. He handed over his notebook. Pages of estimates. Adjustments. Hit confirmations. No commentary. Just data. The officers conferred quietly. Then the gunnery officer said, document everything. Every measurement. Every assumption. We'll test it. A pause. Good work. Within 2 weeks, deflection briefings across the squadron incorporated his geometry. Not the bent post method directly, but the principle behind it. Calculate lead based on realistic combat parameters, not classroom assumptions. Within a month, engineering teams at Wright Field were analyzing improved reticle designs. By summer 1943, revised gun sight markings began appearing in new production aircraft. They incorporated clearer deflection references and range-based compensation guides derived from combat data. Kill ratios shifted, not dramatically, but measurably. Rounds expended per confirmed kill decreased from roughly 5,000 to closer to 3,500. That margin mattered. Fighter pilots began adjusting their attack profiles. Some angles became riskier. Some passes were aborted earlier. Defensive fire was becoming more accurate, not merely suppressive, but predictive. Experience contributed. Improved formations helped. But part of the change, a part rarely highlighted, began with a machinist who refused to accept that the issued tool was sufficient. In 1944, the K-14 gyroscopic computing gun sight entered service. It dynamically calculated lead based on target motion and range, projecting a corrected aiming point automatically. It was sophisticated. It was effective. And its conceptual foundation rested on a simple truth proven over Bremen. You do not shoot at where the enemy is. You shoot at where he will be. He flew 26 missions. He survived the war. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross for exceptional gunnery and contributions to crew survivability. The citation did not mention the site. It did not mention the bend. After the war, he returned to Dayton, back to calibration work. When asked about his service, he said it had been loud and cold. He did not elaborate. Decades later, a military historian researching the evolution of computing gun sights found his name in a declassified archive. The notebook had been preserved. Pages of range estimates and deflection angles, precise handwriting, clean calculations. The historian interviewed him. Why did you do it? The sight didn't work, he replied. So I fixed it. Were you scared? Yes. Every mission. But fear, he said, was not an excuse for bad engineering. Bad engineering killed people. War, in his view, was a systems problem. Logistics, machines, people. If one component failed, the others could not compensate. His job was to ensure the machine did not fail. Everything else, courage, sacrifice, strategy, belonged to someone else. Today, the modified K-13 sight sits in a display case at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. The placard reads simply, K-13 gun sight, modified. Used by 8th Air Force gunners, 1943. Basis for later computing sight development. No name. No narrative. Just the artifact. But those who understand know. In a war measured in percentages, 12 bombers lost per 100, sometimes 20, a 2% improvement changes outcomes. 2% fewer losses mean dozens of aircraft home, hundreds of crewmen alive, thousands of missions completed. In his notebook, dated April 18, 1943, one line appears beneath the calculations. Lead worked at 800 yards. Adjust offset forward 2 degrees next mission. 2 degrees. That was the difference. 2 degrees of metal bent on a cold English hardstand. 2 degrees that shifted the margin. He did not win the air war alone. No one does. But he changed the arithmetic. And in 1943, over Europe, arithmetic was everything. He bent the post 2 degrees. And because of that, some men came home.